Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and this is another Beatles album review. And this is an album that a lot of people probably don't know a whole lot about, and it's the Beatles Story. This is a late November 1964 album that is an interview album, a documentary album, basically. And it came hot on the heels of this album released by VJ just weeks earlier. And it looks like that maybe this was Capitol's response to something that VJ had released. Because Capitol, this is the only information, the only Beatles material that Capitol couldn't lay claim to having the rights to, and that because it's an interview. But in reality, this album had been in the works for a while, and this was supposed to be a live album to begin with. And many people know that the Hollywood Bowl shows were recorded, and they were recorded with the intention of releasing a live album. But both George Martin and the Beatles felt that the quality wasn't good enough because of the fans screaming, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't get released. In its place, we got this. Now, it's important to note that actually some of the Hollywood Bowl show, there's like 48 seconds of Twist and Shout that did make it onto this album. So that little snippet of live music was the first live material officially released by the Beatles. At first look, first of all, this is a double album. It's a gatefold. And I've always been very dismissive and critical of the Capitol design department on these Capitol albums from 64 through really 66. This one actually, they did a pretty nice job on. I always have liked the Union Jack. I like the colors. Got that very British feel to it, though totally American in delivery. It does a nice job here of doing exactly what you think it might do, is giving the appearance of a documentary, although what's inside is not nearly as good as what we're seeing on the outside. So let's talk a little bit about that. These interviews were probably culled from a lot of different sources, and then they put a story together and narrated it. Now, this narration sounds very Hollywood, and to put it up against the Hear the Beatles Tell All of VJ, which is essentially just straight interviews. There's no narration at all. There's no story built around the Beatles for this album, which is what I think it makes this set of interviews far more engaging, far more charming, and far more real. In this case, you have the narration, which gets in the way of the Beatles telling their story.
It started in Liverpool, England. A sound, a feeling, an emotion. It started in Liverpool, England, and swept up the youth of the world. And while adults speaking in many foreign languages looked on in awe, 4 young boys from a poor British seaport slum town, their hairstyle a harmless defiance of convention, their musical style brash, earned renown which they had never dreamed of and perhaps never really wanted.
This album was produced by Los Angeles songwriter and producer Gary Usher, who had done some writing with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. He produced them a bit, and it was done in conjunction with disc jockey and lyricist Roger Christian, and narrated by John Babcock, Al Wyman, and Christian. So a lot of big hitters in here, and that tells me that this was in the works for some time. Maybe they're going to do an interview album in addition to a live album. I don't know, but it seemed like this was probably something they were working on. The prior album before this was Something New, which came out in July of 64. So they had a little bit of time to prepare. Now, what other band can you think of that could have released a double album that was essentially just clips of interviews in the form of a documentary? I can't think of another band in this time or since that could have done that. But they did it, and this album went to number 7 in the charts. It was on the Billboard Top 200 for 17 weeks, and it became a gold record. So that is pretty impressive. All right, now I had spoke of this album, the review I did of Hear the Beatles Tell All. I'm rather glowing of this album because it's kind of close to my heart. And the reason it is because the Beatles are allowed to speak. These are interviews that, particularly the John Lennon interview, goes on for 13 minutes. And on this album, what happens is they're trying to set up a Beatles story, and they're grabbing little bits of interviews to interject within this narration. And some of these little interjections are literally 8 or 10 seconds. I mean, not even that sometimes. So it's very disjointed. The narration doesn't go along with the Beatles quotes at all. It's like oil and water. And I would say that 80% of this album is narration. That leaves about 20% for the interviews and little clips of songs that are played.
His originality of style is evident in his book published by Simon & Schuster. The book, aptly entitled In His Own Right, is a huge sales success. When John was asked if he employed the help of a ghostwriter, he jocularly replied,
"No, I mean, no, who's going to help you with a thing like that?
You never ghostwrite.
As for the offbeat style John employed within its pages, he candidly says,
Well, that's the way I think.
the huge success of his book amply overshadows his self-admitted failures in school.
So in addition to how clumsily this album is written, and that by that I mean the narration, the one thing that they don't include is any interviews of Brian Epstein or George Martin. So if you're going to tell the Beatles story, I would think those two guys would figure in on that, and it seems like that would be an easy interview to get. And in fact, there's some parts in here where the narration says, well, this is explained by Paul, and then George starts talking. So they get some of the Beatles wrong even.
But who came up with the final name Beatles spelled with the B-E-A-T? Paul McCartney explains the origin.
John got the name Beatles
In a vision.
ages ago, you know, when we needed a name and everybody was thinking of a name and he thought of Beatles.
That's why this seems to be completely phony as compared to this album. And if you want to see Beatlemania at its most exploitative in 1964, this is probably it. And it's just simply not believable. It doesn't sound like their story at all. It just sounds like Capitol's story.
When asked about the rumor if he or any member of the group was a millionaire, he casually scoffed.
No, that's another lousy rumour. I wish we were.
Brian Epstein, a millionaire.
No, even he's not one, poor fellow. He works
Where does all the money go?
Well, a lot of it goes to Her Majesty.
She's a millionaire.
And she, too, is a Beatle fan. And as long as we have Beatle fans, I guess we'll always have Beatlemania.
So this is somewhat par for the course of Capitol Records not doing justice to the Beatles and telling their story properly or giving any real effort to telling the story, only to just create some product to sell. And their story, the Capitol telling of the story, gets in the way of the actual story. So you're gonna, if you listen to this, I mean, these aren't hard to find. You can find, I've got a copy on the original Capitol, which I believe this is. Let's see, I don't even know. No, this is an orange Capitol. I also have one on Apple label. I've got an original rainbow Capitol. So I just happen to get all those, not because I like it, because they're relatively cheap. And it's kind of fun, I guess, to have it. I don't listen to it too much. This is my go-to interview disc that I listen to. So one of the things also that I brought this one out. On the back of this album, you see an album that's advertised as the Beatles songbook by the Hollywood Strings. So this was another Capitol album, and they performed some of the instrumentation and backing on this record too. So that barely helps the poor execution of this record. Now, one of the things I'm going to say about this album, I mentioned the cool design, and what would have been really cool, and this is one of the missed opportunities the Capitol made time after time. If had it been a live album, imagine having one disc interviews, one disc live music. So if you had the interviews, say on the caliber of this record as one of the discs, and just gone forward with releasing the live stuff, I don't know that the Beatles and George Martin would have had any say in that. I wonder. And who cares? George Martin and the Beatles in 1977, when there was some competition with the Star Club tapes coming out, they thought it was okay to release then. So, I mean, really, how bad would it have been? It would have been a very cool document. And talk about a wonderful way to promote that double album if it was released that way. All you fans out there, all you girls, all you kids who couldn't go to the show, this is the show right here. And we're going to include this beautiful gatefold album. We're going to have glossy color photos here, and there's going to be a nice big poster that comes out and unfolds, and that's going to be our gift to you. But that's not how Capitol did business. They were not interested in giving something back. They were interested in, I think, taking from. So unfortunately, That didn't happen. So anyway, in the end, we have what could be, is this rock's first double album? Eat Your Heart Out, Blonde on Blonde, and Freak Out. This might be it. Actually, it wouldn't be considered that because it's a documentary. But I mean, what other band could pull this off and have a documentary go to number 7 on the charts and be a gold record? It just shows you their sweeping popularity and how important they were in the pop culture, even in that given time, when still half the people probably figured they were just a passing fad. Well, that's my story on the Beatles Story. Appreciate you watching. Plenty more reviews coming. You'll find them all here on Pop Goes the 60s.
This is the biography of Beatlemania.